Today I'm speaking with Jenny McGrath. Jenny, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask in a second where you are, but I'll give a bio real quick first and then you can fill us in. Jenny, for anyone that doesn't know her, she's a licensed mental health counselor and a somatic experiencing practitioner, which I'll ask you to define that in a minute. She has over 10 years of experience as a movement teacher. She works primarily with clients hoping to heal from religious trauma and religious sexual shame. She's passionate about helping individuals and communities to feel more free. She is a member of the Purity Culture Research Collective and is currently researching the transnationalizing of purity culture, the psychoaffective impacts of those socialized as young white women in purity culture that compelled them to become missionaries and international aid workers. She's recently published an article to the Journal of Theology and Sexuality on her analysis called Pure to Purpose, Socializing Purity in White Women's International Aid Work. She herself grew up in purity culture and was a missionary in Uganda at the age of 19. Her work is informed by professional as well as personal experience, which we'll talk about very shortly. She has an online course called Embodied Sexuality that helps people who grew up in purity culture to get the sex education and information that they never had in a nuanced, trauma-informed way. By the way, I'll have the links for how you can connect with Jenny beneath this video. She also has an online movement studio that helps individuals explore connection to their bodies through various psychosomatic informed practices. And aside from work, Jenny and her husband are living van life and exploring North America with their boxer dog. So tell us more about yourself, Jenny.
Yeah, so I am currently living in a van with my husband and boxer dog. We're in a random town in Utah right now. About 3 months ago, we moved out of where we were living in Seattle and into a van and have just been exploring the country. It's been a wild and fun adventure so far.
Hmm. What's your boxer dog's name?
Amari.
Amari. Nice, nice. And where is your next
Mhm.
journey, leg of the journey to for your van life?
We're we're making our way down to Phoenix. I actually have a couple of dear friends from Seattle that are flying down there to meet me for this weekend. So I'm gonna go hang out with them, and my husband's gonna take our dog on a little adventure. I don't know where they're gonna go yet. We kind of don't have anything planned most of the time, which we kind of love. It's just meeting a lot of locals and saying, where do you think we should go? And we just went last week to Valley of Fire State Park in Nevada, and I was literally crying. It was so beautiful. And I had never heard of it before, but it was just someone had said, yeah, you should go here. So it's been really sweet to just see things that I never would have gone to otherwise.
That's so awesome. Very jealous. Very jealous. Well, as you probably know, what this channel is all about stories. We're storytellers. So I would love to invite you, if you could, to take us back to the earliest days. Like, what was your background like? And specifically, how did you get exposed to Christianity? And then what happened from there?
Sure. I was born into it for sure. I think I'll actually start maybe before I was born because I think that gives some important context and a lot of the stories that I heard growing up. And so my dad grew up Catholic and my mom grew up Lutheran, and they both in their early 20s had some pretty significant conversion experiences before they met each other. So by the time they met, they would identify as evangelical, and they got married. Shortly after that, my dad got Crohn's disease and was really, really, really sick. He was down to like 95 pounds. They weren't sure if he was going to make it.
Wow.
And yeah, and he experienced what they felt was really God's providence in saving him. And so they made a decision, you saved us, we love you, we want to dedicate our lives to you. And so before I was born, when they had just my two oldest brothers, they were missionaries in Japan. And then when my mom got pregnant with my third brother, they moved back to the States primarily because of health complications. Um, so I have three older brothers, and I'm the youngest and the only girl, which was quite an adventure growing up.
I'm sure.
So by the time I came around, I was born in Denver. And at that point, my dad was an associate pastor of a church. And then by the time I was 4, he was working for Cook Communications, a Christian book publishing company. So we moved from Denver to Colorado Springs. And we kind of moved 30 minutes east of Colorado Springs. My parents built a house they were really excited about. It was a 30-minute drive to the nearest grocery store or gas station. So we were very remote, which in some ways was amazing. Like I had this incredible feral childhood where like a lot of my days were just finding things out in the middle of prairies and forests. And I think
That's so
honestly a
awesome.
big part of that, yeah, it was really great. And I think a big part of that is why I live the way I do now. Like I've just never learned conventional living. And so when I've tried to do it, I feel very stifled and stuck. So I was homeschooled most of my life and really immersed in Christianity because I was homeschooled. A lot of times, you know, me and my brothers were in soccer or baseball. I did dance. And so we met friends that way, but primarily the only way I saw friends my age roughly was in Sunday school. So Sundays were something that I really, really looked forward to because I wanted to be around kids my age. I really loved the flannel boards. I really loved the animal crackers and everything that came with church. And yeah, some of my earliest memories in that world were being captivated by stories and the connecting of songs into stories about Zacchaeus and all of these things that really drew me in. I would say I, from a very young age, felt no question about whether Christianity was right or wrong. A very specific type of Christianity. I remember my neighbor was Catholic, and I was very, very concerned about her soul by the time I was 7 or 8 years old.
Oh yeah.
And yeah,
I was gonna say too, I can definitely relate to that whole. You mentioned flannel graph and the animal crackers. That's like if you add in the wordless book and the little bracelet with the little colors. That's pretty much the same thing. And I honestly had a Catholic neighbor too, a little girl that I was concerned about, and even got in trouble because I preached the gospel to her, and her dad came to my dad and said, "What are you doing?" But yeah, I can definitely relate.
yeah, I have this very vivid memory. There were other people at our house, and I hadn't known. I, for some reason, I was probably like 6 or 7, and I told my neighbor, "Those people are Catholic," and she was like, "I'm Catholic," and it was this a gasp moment of like, "But you're my friend, you can't be," and there was such a deep concern, and I remember also there was this piano book we had that had an image of Jesus in your heart. And so for me, inviting Jesus into my heart felt like such a literal thing. And I did it over and over and over again. For me, I really felt like I almost every night I developed kind of a compulsion of the way that I prayed was very specific. I would ask for God to cleanse my heart and mind and spirit and soul and wring me out like a sponge and make me pure. And I also became very, very terrified of hell. By the time I was 9 years old, I remember my parents would say, "Good night, see you in the morning." And I would consciously say good night, and I wouldn't say see you in the morning because I was afraid that if I died, the last thing I said would be a lie and I would go to hell. And so I was so conscious of how I was living and trying to be pure and trying to be good. And my 10th birthday, my birthday wish was that I could live to be 1,000 years old because I thought then I would learn to be good enough and pure enough because I accidentally cussed when the cat got out of my hands or things that happened that I would ruminate about for so long. And so
Mm.
I developed a pretty crippling germophobia as well, because I was so afraid that would make me get sick and make me die. And so I needed to avoid germs. I needed to be clean. I got really bad eczema on my hands because I would wash them 30 times a day. And so there was kind of this duality where that was going on. And there was also still such a captivation of the story. And I think the older I got, the more I became captivated with the person of Jesus and the story of Jesus, especially because I think I felt so dirty and bad and wrong. And so believing that there was this person that loved me so much that they died for me was something that I didn't know how to wrap my head around, but also I felt so compelled by that story.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the wanting to live 1,000 years so that you can really, eliminate sin, as it were. But I didn't have that one. That's an interesting take on it. I like that. I like that, meaning I like it in quotes. But mine was more. Do you know the name Johnny Erickson Tata? She
Oh,
would.
yes.
Okay, so
Mm-hmm.
so her book, where for anyone that doesn't know her, Johnny was a Christian, and she basically went and took a dive into I believe it was a lake or a pond of some kind. It was more shallow than she thought. Snapped her neck on the bottom of the lake or a rock or something, and became a quadriplegic. So everything from her neck up is okay, but everything from the neck down doesn't work. And I remember reading her book about how she really felt like that was God just crushing her to keep her focus on Him. And of course, at the time, that seemed like a horrible story. But as it went on, and I'd read other theologians, a lot of my prayers, and I heard this echoed from other guys like at Bible college in men's Bible studies, we would specifically pray, God, do whatever it takes to crush us so that our focus is on you. And of course, we'd bring in that illustration of, I think it's frankincense or myrrh, where you'd crush it, and that's the only time it smells good is when it's crushed. And so, we would say, God, please crush us. We want to do whatever it takes. And if it means, we all, of course, we're dying to get married and have sex. So if it means celibacy, make us celibate. If it means we become quadriplegics, whatever, make us get our focus on you. And then the other big thing that I think was really interesting to me was the idea of the repetition of the actual spiritual practices, the disciplines of, like, if I can read my Bible not for 30 minutes a day, but for like every minute, like it's just open. And so if I walk by it, okay, read a chapter, and all right, you go out for a minute. Well, oh, you walk back by it again, read another chapter, just on your mind, memorizing Bible verses nonstop. And it was this idea of, like, if you can pray to God to do whatever it takes to focus you on Him, and you can do the spiritual disciplines more and more, almost like an OCD, you're on the right path. You're safe. And I think eventually it becomes a pride issue. We're like, I've done a lot. I must be on the right track,
Absolutely. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think for me that pivotal moment was the night of my 13th birthday. I got my purity ring. And so for me, enacting my faith was so connected to my chastity and my purity. And before then, I was a 12-year-old girl who had the biggest crush on Paul Walker and, famous boy band singers, and had like a folder on my computer of hot guys that I would like look at or things like that. And then when I got my purity ring, I was like, okay, now I have to be serious. I have to delete this folder. I have to stop thinking about anything that has to do with sex. I read the book. I can't remember who wrote it. It was called Sex Isn't the Problem, Lust Is.
Okay.
And it was all about anything that even thinking about sex was wrong or bad. And so there became a lot of inward kind of um, beating myself up for just normal adolescent desires or wants. And yeah, and so I would, yeah, even as you're saying that, I'm like, yeah, I would read my Bible probably an hour every night and every morning. And when my mind would quote unquote wander or think about things that are normal, natural things for a 13, 14-year-old girl to think about, I would become so distraught because that was a symptom that I wasn't pure enough. I wasn't clean enough. And so it really propelled me to feel so much shame. And what happened was I started to dissociate and really disconnect from my body. And even in high school, a really frequent question I would ask my parents is, what does it mean when you feel like you're dreaming? And they were always like, we don't know what you're talking about. And I had a very disembodied experience for a very long time because I had reached such a critical moment of stress in my nervous system that I went into what we would call a state of dissociation and leaving my body. And yeah, so those are some of the thoughts that come up of what started to stir around my high school years.
Was when you say disassociation, it kind of makes me think of a protective measure. Like, do you feel like there was some aspect of this that you were just trying to either protect yourself from, or just block out in some way, either memories that you had made, or just something that you were afraid of? I don't want to make those memories, so we'll block it out so it can't happen. Like, what did that mean to you?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it was both. I think that I experienced, in the somatic world, we would say that we dissociate when we experience an inescapable threat. So the idea is that our nervous system has a few different states. We have the state of rest and digest, where we're able to be socially engaged and feel alive and curious. And then when we sense a threat, we will move into a state of fight or flight, and we will try to do something to get rid of or attack whatever the threat is. If our nervous system senses that there's nothing I can do to run away, there's nothing I can do to fight this off, we essentially play dead. We go into an energy consumption state to protect ourselves. And all mammals do this. If you see kind of an impala get chased and caught by a lion, you will think the impala is dead because the hope is maybe this predator will drag me to their den and I'll get a chance to escape later. So I'll just shut down for now. And so the bind for me was really that I was experiencing my own sexuality as an inescapable threat. Like, it was this thing that I wasn't supposed to feel, but I couldn't not feel. And so the only way for me to get through that was to go into a state of what we'd call a dorsal vagal state, or a state of freeze or dissociation, which I've seen time and time and time again is a very familiar state, primarily for white women who were socialized in purity culture, because of the ways in which purity and chastity is so focused on us in that world. I, of course, didn't know that at the time, but it became a way for me to kind of get through those years, I thought.
Yeah. What role would the theology play in that, do you think, in terms of either you're a sinner, you're a horrible sinner, God's looking in your head and can see your thoughts, even you can't hide them from him. Even, you have presumptuous sins, you can't trust yourself, just trust in the Lord, but don't lean on your own understanding. You're desperately wicked, so much that you can't even understand it. All your righteousness is like a filthy rag. Did that play a role, do you think, in the dissociation?
Absolutely. All of that. Yes. And, I remember, I don't know how many times I heard the phrase, your heart is deceitful above all else. And all of the ways in which I had learned to not trust myself. And what it also did was it enabled me to be good in that world, because I was so unaware. I became so unaware of my own needs, my own desires, that I literally said for years, my body is like a machine. And I would treat my body as such. And so there was this weird dichotomy again for me, in that this was part of my life. And I also was a competitive dancer. And so dance was a place where I could express sensuality and even sexuality in a condonable way. And so I felt like it was this weird ebb and flow for me. And dance was the one place where I often didn't feel dissociated. And I felt like, okay, this is the thing. And then when I was 14 years old, my dance teachers took me and two other girls to New York to see what the dance scene was like there, to take some classes. And for whatever reason, they decided to sneak us three high school girls into a nightclub. And unfortunately, I had a experience with a sexual predator at
Mm,
this nightclub as a 14-year-old. And
wow.
I told nobody about it because that was my fault. That was my, me breaking the agreement of my purity ring. And so I, after that, kind of doubled down into how much I needed to work to try to be good. And 3 months after I went to New York, I fell in dance class and I shattered my foot. And it was 100% what you were saying, where I was like, God saw that I was going down the path of wickedness. God saw what a seductress I am. So God broke my foot because God needed me to really rededicate my life to Him. And it was around that same time I read in Jeremiah, how do you expect to race with horses if you run with men and get tired? And for how I translated that was, I had always said I wanted to be a missionary, but I wasn't even being a good Christian in America. And so, how much more did I need to dedicate myself to this? And so,
Mm,
after that experience, I really kind of cut off relationships with all of my friends in high school because they weren't Christian enough. And I only was friends with people who were accountability partners or who were in my youth group. I started leading a prayer group for my youth group before youth group. We would like meet and pray. And then we would go into into our youth group. And I was reading my Bible so much that chunks of it started to fall out. And I took so literally, the word of God does not go out and return void. So by this time, I actually went to public high school, and I would leave little bits of my Bible in like the bathroom stalls or in like family members' houses or different things like that, because I was so sure that this would be so potent and someone would read some of these words and that they would become a Christian. And that became my mission. I can say more. I'm aware I'm talking a lot about this, so I want to even just see what's coming up for you as I'm sharing.
Sure, sure. Well, one thing I was just going to ask about too is when you're going through this, the kind of the question that comes up to me a lot through people's stories and the different details and nuances is like, where were you throughout this period with God in terms of the salvation? Like, did you feel like it was more he was? I mean, it sounds like he was more out to get you if you stepped out of line. Was there ever a point at which, I guess what I'm asking is there a point where you just kind of said, you know what, he is a loving father. What could he possibly do that's not ultimately a blessing? Whether even if he crushes me, is it not a blessing from the Lord? He is the most loving father possible. His arms, even like where Aslan is described in Narnia as by C.S. Lewis, is he's not safe, but he's good, and that sense that he will do what is right. Not just in the overall sense of, well, not the judge of the earth do right, but like he specifically got a plan for you. Did your relationship with Christ ever evolve to a point where you felt like wow, I'm safe. I am blessed, not in the colloquial sense of putting up the word blessed on your mantle, but like I am truly blessed, not because of anything in me, but because God has chosen to delight in me, even though I didn't have anything to be delighted in necessarily because of my sin. But I'm good. It is well with my soul. Like, did that sense of peace ever come at any point in the journey?
I think that that was how I experienced. I want to say yes, and I experienced breaking my foot as that, as
Okay.
that I wanted nothing more than to be a professional dancer. And I knew immediately when this happened, my life got very derailed. And there was so much grief. And I couldn't, or I didn't access that grief because the narrative also quickly became, but God did this to save me from myself. God did this because God had higher plans for me than I had for myself.
Mm.
And it was around this same time, I was still in a cast recovering from surgery, that I saw the Invisible Children film, if you're familiar with that.
If I did, I forget about it. No, but tell us about it.
Okay, so there was three young white men from California that went to northern Uganda, and they filmed a documentary style film about child soldiers in northern Uganda. And it was incredibly emotionally evocative. It led into tons of youth kind of deciding to get involved in international aid, and I was one of them. So I was 14 years old, begging my parents to let me drop out of high school and get a GED so that I could move to Uganda. And thankfully, they did not let that happen. But I did end up going to Uganda pretty soon after I graduated high school. I joined Youth with a Mission. And so I did a discipleship training school right after I graduated high school. And then I ended up joining staff with Colorado Springs YWAM. And I was a field worker. So I was sort of by myself in Uganda, but I was also leading teams from the States and from South Africa back to Uganda. And so by that point, I it wasn't ever, it didn't feel like it was a question about God. Like I saw God as this good father, and I still always felt so wicked and so dirty and so vile. And so it was this both and, where I felt so sure of God sending Jesus to die for me. And I felt so sure that I was a piece of shit. And so there was this sense of how can both of these be true? And so often I felt the most peace when I was in prayer, and I would spend hours a day. Different YWAM bases often have a prayer room. And so I would spend hours a day in different prayer rooms. And I would also weave in a lot of dance into intercession, and I would play music and I would dance. And really, in those moments, is when I felt the most connected. And I felt like I was in the throne room, like heaven had opened up, and my dancing and my movement and my prayer were these portals for me to feel like, yes, this is the realm that you're in, this is where you're safe, this is where you're okay.
Mm.
I think is how I would answer that question.
Yeah. It's so interesting, just as a quick reflection before you go into the next part of your story. It's such a weird thing when you look back at those kind of parts of our stories, and I can relate to a lot of it, to think, just maybe to hit a few high points, you're weaving in that message of God is so good that even if he slays you, yet can you trust him and praise him. The Lord gives and takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And it's almost like this contrast of like the very kindest thing that Satan could theoretically do. He's like the candy man in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, who's trying to get the kids. He's like everything he can give you that's so sweet and delightful and wonderful. Compare that to the nastiest thing that Yahweh could do to you. And the nastiest thing that Yahweh could do to you is actually the better choice than the nicest thing Satan could do. Like God will only do things to bless his children. And you have that. And you weave in, of course, the theology again, we talked about, where like you're a problem just because you exist. Even John 3 talks about like you're condemned already. Like you're condemned before you even start. You're a child of Adam, and you have this sin nature, which of course Romans extrapolates. You're born a problem. You're born a sinner. And so you kind of don't like yourself in some ways. You kind of do, but you kind of don't, because you're kind of a child of the king, but you're also a child of sin. And you don't feel safe in your own skin because you've got this body that's kind of like this dualism of like this body is from God, but it's kind of bad because it keeps causing me trouble, especially when you bring in sexuality and puberty. And just a reflection I'm getting to is it's like it's all not real. Like none of it's real. And when you realize that you spend years, decades of your life under these weird constructs, it just hits you like, what a mind job this was, that all these things were so enrapturing to us. It captures your attention, it captures your emotion, your psychology, your ability to heal, your ability to even sleep right and rest. Your heart races if you do the wrong thing. And like, for example, I remember as a kid, I've said this before, but when I was a teenager, if I was like in church and say a woman was wearing like a dress where the sleeve had come off a little bit and you could see like her bra strap, if I saw that, I felt guilty. And if I looked twice or more, I felt really guilty, like extremely guilty. And you're living under this whole thing. And it's like, it's never been real. And it's got nothing to do with who you are or reality. It's just such a strong testament to the ability to indoctrinate and to completely give you a mind job for this worldview that's, in my opinion, at this point, so sickening. But going back to your story, like, did you at that point, were there any seeds of this worldview might have faults, or was there still this backdrop of like, regardless of my experience, whether I feel like I'm obeying God or not, if I'm close to God or not, um, like the prodigal son kind of thing, I might be far from God, I might be close. He's still the father that loves me. He's waiting for me. He's true. He is good. The Bible's true. The Bible's infallible. Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior. Was there any questions about that backdrop worldview going on yet? Or like, when did that first start to appear?
At that point, I don't think there was any question in my mind that it was about God or about him in any way. I think I remember one moment. It was on my YWAM discipleship training schools outreach. We were in I went to Thailand and Malaysia, and I was about to give a testimony. And I remember telling my outreach leader, I still do feel grief about breaking my foot. Like, and I think I was still trying to make sense of it. And her reply was, it's not about how bad you are, it's about how good God is. Which I didn't feel like was what I was asking, but it was kind of the almost the trigger word of like, okay, all right, you're right. Let me just put away that grief. It's not about how bad I am, it's about how good God is. And so I do think there was these moments where I felt it, but at the same time, the heart is deceitful above all else. And so I couldn't trust my grief. That was my own sinful nature. That was my own pride. That was my own arrogance. And so the psychological hoops I would jump through then would be very, very quick. I was like a gymnast at that point to get back onto this is about God. And I was, this was also, I was in high school when DC Talk released their Jesus Freak Voice of the Martyrs book. And so I was pretty sure that by the time I was 23, I would die for the Lord. Like,
Wow.
Jim Elliot,
Yeah.
that's right? Jim
Yep.
Elliot. Yeah. Like I had read his book. That was going to be almost my senior quote was, he is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. I instead used a Bible verse as my senior quote, but I almost had that one. And that's what I lived by, this life is nothing. So let me get rid of it as quickly as possible to get to heaven. And I think by that point, I had an older brother who by that point had kind of said, this Christianity thing doesn't make any sense. And I was so worried for him that, and friends of mine from high school, that I was like, sorry, it's like all these pieces are coming together because it was such this poignant moment where there was also the stories of Columbine and She Said Yes. And so then that was also so influencing me and saying, okay, well, if I die for my faith, then my brother will see it's really real. Then my friend will see it's really real. And there was this almost desire to be martyred so that I could prove how much I loved God. I could get extra status in heaven. Honestly, I was really conscious of that. Like, I'm a number 3 on the Enneagram, if that means anything. And so I think even in that spirituality, I was like, I want to be the best of the best in this. Um, so there were those moments, but then they kind of got doubled down into, but this is my life. And
Mm.
so even when I moved to Uganda, and I was in Uganda, and then I also did a YWAM Bible school in South Africa for 9 months. And I basically, my immune system shut down because of many, many traumas and things that I was experiencing. I had boils all over my body for like 6 months that
Wow.
were the most excruciating pain. And all of that was this sense of why God, and if this is what you need to do, God. It was very much that, like, if it's possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, yours be done, was sort of this mantra that I lived by. Even as my body as a 20-year-old was just shutting down,
Mm.
I viewed that as its own process of sanctification and of kind of trying to prove myself good to God.
Mm. I can relate to so much of that. And just add one quick extra thought that I'm sure you can relate to too is I was under an incredible amount of preaching about the word slavery. Not the slavery of slaves obey your master, but that you are a slave to God and that he is the owner. Paul introduces himself as a doulos, as a bond slave of Christ. And so we are the same way. And I remember extensive preaching, primarily from John MacArthur. He was a major, major influence in my life for literally decades. But hearing him and others talk about the slave issue and like, you don't get to talk back to your master. You don't get to tell God what you're going to do with your life. And then it was kind of augmented by when I was at Bob Jones University, there was a preacher, ironically at a Baptist Arminian church, who was talking through Romans 9 about the passage where it says, he is the potter, we're the clay. Doesn't he have the right to do with the clay what he wants? He's the potter. And you really get the sense eventually that you don't own your own body. And I know it's going to relate to some of the stuff we'll probably touch on shortly with purity culture, but this idea like your body, your whole life, your existence is not yours. You can deceive yourself all you want, but at the end of the day, bow your knee to God and it will go well with you if you do. And the more that you try to buck his authority and to buck his ultimately his loving kindness, even though his hesed, even if that feels hard to you today, his loving kindness is actually in the long run exactly what you need, even if you can't see it. Kind of like the prodigal son couldn't see the love of his father. And so this overarching desire to just say, I need to see this all from God's perspective. And one of the things, I'll add this real quick, one of the things that became really important to me at that part of my story was I was fully convinced that evolution was complete nonsense. And so I began to extrapolate out this idea of like, if evolution's nonsense, then how do you extrapolate the other side of it? It's like, well, God has designed things very specifically. And so I would say to myself, well, there's something about everything, the way he's designed a hummingbird, the way he's designed tree rings, the way he's designed the universe. It's not like he's just scattering marbles and hoping they land somewhere nice. He's actually the most brilliant mathematician, artist, everything, poet, and beyond your wildest dreams, beautiful and creative. And so therefore your goal as a Christian is almost to say, I not just want to honor the Bible and honor what I'm being taught in theology, but I want to look at this universe and say, God, your fingerprints are everywhere. And so I began writing what became a 1,000-page worldview book. Fortunately, I never published it, but to just say, what are the aspects of this creation that exemplify God's nature or the gospel or the kingdom or heaven? And that became my lifeblood for years, was just writing this book about how do you see God's fingerprints as it were everywhere. And I use the example, in the Matrix, when Neo gets shot in the first movie, he gets shot and they think he's dead. Then he stands back up. And as soon as he stands back up, he sees the code everywhere of the Matrix. it's as if his worldview shifted. And I began to see like God's fingerprints everywhere. I didn't need a miracle. I just saw God in everything. Every little nuance of every aspect of our bodies or fingernails, everything was God. And that just threw me into a passion for the Lord. But again, the all-consuming part of it is you have, when you get that far, when you're that far gone, you have to take all your cognitive dissonance and stuff it away really hard. And all the things like that doesn't feel right, you have to ignore it. And I guess maybe that would be a good segue to ask, what were you thinking at that point in terms of like what were the things that got you out of such an intense passion for the Lord and a willingness to let him crush you and you'll still praise him?
Yeah. So as you were talking, the verse that came up was also, these light and momentary uh, struggles are nothing compared to the weight of glory, and there's a sense of all of these phrases in which they're so ingrained in my mind. So I came back to the States for what I thought would just be a few months, and I had planned to go back to Uganda. And I had what I would probably consider a psychotic break. I was working every day from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. trying to fundraise and create a ministry in northern Uganda and support it. And I was 20 years old and had a lot of my own unprocessed trauma, and was experiencing a lot of vicarious trauma. And so I actually ended up going with my team from YWAM to North Carolina. YWAM had a North American Leadership Conference, and there was a man there named Dan Allender who was talking about longevity in serving professions. And so I was like, this is what I need to learn how to do. I just need to learn how to do this long term. I need to figure out what's sustainable. And so I went up to him and I asked him if he knew about vicarious trauma. And I ended up learning about the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. And so I was actually accepted to the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology as a life experience equivalent to a bachelor's degree. So I had never gone to college, but I went straight into grad school for a master's in counseling psychology. And again, my plan was, okay, I will just learn how to do this long term, and then I'll move back to Uganda. And I was actually warned by people in YWAM when I was going to the Seattle school. It's a pretty liberal school. Be very careful. You need to you're going to Seattle, which is also very liberal. So you need to double down. And so I did. I started going to Mars Hill Church, Mark Driscoll's church in Seattle. And that was
Wow.
my safe place. Yeah. And the Seattle school was the scary place where, one of my very first classes, this was back in 2012, our professor asked, who is God, who is Jesus, and who the hell are you? And I remember everyone answering very esoterically and theoretically. And I literally stood up and listed 17 attributes of who God was based on scripture. I was that person at the school. And I, in that same class, had a 45-minute debate with a fellow student in front of 100 students about why I didn't think that gay marriage should be legalized and how we were in a Christian nation and that was an abomination. And think something. I had people come up to me afterwards and say, can I explain to you why what you said was so harmful to who I am? And that was the very first moment. Actually, not the first moment. I did have a moment in South Africa when I was in Bible school with a few trans prostitutes or trans sex workers who ended up singing a lament to me. And it was the most beautiful thing. And it was these moments of disrupting my very heteronormative theology about who was good, who was pure, who God loved. And so it started to crack open a little bit. And so I think, honestly, homosexuality and queerness was kind of the what started. It was like the sand in the shoe that started to rub, where I was like, what have I actually been taught about this, and what is true about this? And so I started to look at other authors and other writers aside from the ones that I had been taught my whole life. I also had a class there called Multicultural Perspectives, which was the first time I had really, really been challenged in my whiteness as someone stepping into northern Uganda in a professional context as an 18-year-old. And so I think both the ideas of sexuality and the ideas of race really caused me to look at and peel back some of these layers. So once that happened, it was both a long journey and not a long journey. I was still, I had actually left Mars Hill at that point, but I was on staff at another PCA church in Seattle. And
so were you a Calvinist at
I
that
was
point?
introduced. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I started reading Bart Ehrman, and I started reading Elaine Pagels, and I started kind of learning from people who made me realize why I was given such a vague answer to some of those questions that I had for a very long time. And I had also said going into the Seattle school, if something can be deconstructed, I want it to be deconstructed. And I didn't exactly know where that journey would take me. It's taken me where I never thought I would be. And, it's so funny, as my husband and I are in van life, we're driving around the country listening to Bart Ehrman's latest book, and continually uncovering all of these layers of indoctrination. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago, my therapist said I had what she referred to as the opposite of a psychotic break, where it's like you've actually like broken into thinking about the world in a not insane way. And I almost took offense to that still, but I was also like, but I actually think you're right. Like, the ways in which I have now come to see the world make it more and more shocking to see, especially what's playing out in our politics and in our country's leadership in this moment. And to know, sometimes I have to explain to my husband like my own old cognitive dissonance, because he's like, make this make sense. He grew up in Christianity, but not in the same brand and strains as I did. And so I feel like I'm able to kind of step in and the Bible verses come back or these things come back. And then I'm able to step out and go, and it is so nice to not feel horrible all of the time. And it is so nice to not have every decision I make be based out of fear of where I'm going to spend eternity. And so I feel like my own nervous system has just calmed down a lot since I've left that world.
Mm.
And, I've been in private practice for nearly 9 years now. And a lot of the clients I work with are also from that world. And I work with clients that are Christian. And I work with a lot of clients that are on somewhere in their journey of deconstructing and realizing how psychologically and somatically damaging this world has been for them.
Mm. One thing that really stands out in your story, and I've seen it in my life and other people's, but the idea that you're under so much pressure as a young person, even a teenager and preteen, to be thinking about eternity and your impact on the world, on rewards, being able to have a crown to present to the Lord someday, to be able to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. All this pressure, and the pressure of the Lord's coming back at any moment, perhaps. And at least, even if he's not coming back for a while, each individual person's life could be snuffed out like that. And so you can't let people just die in their sins. And it's as if everyone around you is on fire. I remember I used to, that movie Firestarter, I think it was, Stephen King, where the girl could just think of it and the people just combust. I kind of mentally connected those dots, and in my mind, I would, especially if I saw like a really pretty girl, I'd be like, you don't think about her curves and her sexuality. See her in your mind as on fire, because that may be the more real aspect of who she really is and what she's about to experience. Don't focus on her attraction. Focus on her soul. For goodness sake, it's like she is on the way to hell if she's not saved. And so this pressure gets on all of us to just be involved so early. And yet the takeaway that I see in so many stories is you weren't like we weren't informed enough, but we were also under so much pressure before even our brains were necessarily formed in the right way to be able to discern certain things. And a lot of us we were literally preaching before we knew anything. It's as if we were out of diapers, of course, physically, but we were still in diapers emotionally and psychologically. And I remember even it kind of the first time it struck me, Joshua Harris, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. I saw him in person when I was a young teenager. I saw him in person at an event, and I remember thinking to myself, "You're like 3 days older than I am. Like, how is it that you're preaching to thousands and thousands of people? It's like people just elected you to be the star child of the month. No offense to him, of course, but like he's the star child that everyone is praising, and he's just a few days older than me, perhaps." And I was like, I don't know that you should be talking yet. Like, are you have you really formed your worldview enough? And it is actually that was one of the things that got me out of pastoral ministry. I became convinced from the pastoral epistles that it was elders, like it literally says elders should be your leaders, people, and it says you should have raised your own family. It's as if you have like your own flock that's really small, and if you can take good care of this little tiny flock of 4, 5, 6 people, then we'll give you a bigger flock. But let's test on the little flock first. And so as I'd spent all these years preparing to be a pastor, I was like, oh shoot, what am I going to do now? Because I don't want to be a pastor. I don't think young men should be pastors. And I became convinced that God was opening doors for Bible translation in a jungle environment. So I was going to do like the New Tribes Wycliffe path, which I did do some of. But I realized at that point, in terms of just the spiritual authority, young people should not be taking these huge roles. And as I look back on it now, I'm thinking like not just in terms of ministry roles, but even just the idea to say, I know what I believe and I'm sure it's right. Like we don't give the human experience the right perspective to say you can't make those decisions as a child. And I know that's why they want to indoctrinate children so that they kind of just jump over that whole leapfrog over the whole thing so that the kids don't have a chance to really think for themselves. But when you look back at it, you feel like I should have been told, we should have all been told, there's a lot more to this story. And also, your perspectives are going to change. You shouldn't be so dogmatic and land one spot and be like, this is my hill. I'm going to defend it till kingdom come. You shouldn't land there until you've been exposed to a whole bunch of other ideas, a whole bunch of other people, traveled, for goodness sake, talk to people of different religions, like not talk to them in the sense of like, I want to proselytize, but like just go talk to them and let them tell their story and walk away. Just learn from other people. But it was always from the earliest days. We're so privileged. I'm so privileged to be in this country and in this right religion and in the right denomination, the right interpretation, and I need to spread it to everybody. And when you get told that and convinced that from so young, you realize later on that's just not so, that you're kind of given this perspective and authority, even as perhaps as for sure as a Christian, but even as a white person, you're given this pretend authority to just transform the world before you know what's what. It's like you don't even know what's up and down yet, and you're trying to be the king of the castle, and it's like, wow, what arrogance we were groomed for, and that we gladly accepted to our shame. And it's amazing to me that the beautiful journey to be able to say, there's a lot of stuff I don't know. And until I know more, I need to just have a learner's heart and not be so dogmatic and certainly not be preaching to everybody. But what a transformative thing that was to realize I don't need to tell everybody what to think. I can just learn. I can just enjoy the process of being an observer. And to lose that perspective of I've got to save everybody. I remember, I'll end with this and pass the ball back to you. I remember that sense of like when I'd walk into a room, say a party or a church event, anything, my immediate thought was not, oh, it's nice to see everybody. It was, I wonder who's not saved, and I wonder who's a Christian who's not living for the Lord. I was like scanning the room for those two things immediately, every minute of every event like that. And it's like now you can just look in the room and say, it's so nice to see you all. And I just, tell me about your day. How you doing? And there's no agenda,
Yeah, it breaks my heart for how many years, especially those dearest to me, like my brother or various people I saw as projects. That it was like I couldn't see their humanity. I couldn't ask them genuinely, like, okay, why do you think this is bonkers? Like, could you tell me? It was like, I cannot listen to you. I just have to convert you. And there was this kind of colloquial phrase in the missionary world that God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. And so I held so strongly to that as a 19-year-old that was like, I'm not qualified, but I'm called. So it doesn't matter that I'm not qualified. And I guess what came to mind was another one of those cracks where for whatever reason, I don't know where I got this in my mind, but I was like 22 at this point and I was preaching to an entire church in northern Uganda. And there was, elders that had walked 7 miles to come listen to me preach. And there was a moment where I said, do you think that I'm smarter than you? Do you think that I have something from you that you don't have, that you would come to watch me? And of course, it was lost on me that, of course, I felt that way because I was there preaching in the first place. But one of the old men from the village stood up and said, we are Black people, and therefore we are the sons of Ham. And so we are a cursed people. And so we need white people to bring the good news. And I didn't know at that time that that was a message back from slavery. That was a message back from the original missionary imperialism. And I brought them back to the story of Noah and I was like, does anyone see anywhere that Ham is Black? And everyone was like, no. But it did become this moment for me of like, how is it that I have come to see I am called and I am white and that is why I am called, and so it started to crack open some of these layers of learning about the history of US imperialism and the history of Christian imperialism and how my body participated in those oppressive movements of dominance and power.
Yeah, it's amazing when you look back at it. We didn't do it, of course, for colonialism or white supremacy, but you realize there's some underlying fibers of that woven in. It's staggering and it's kind of scary. Just to keep this part of your story going, I was curious too. This is moving a little bit towards purity culture because I know we want to focus on that for sure at some point. But as you were, at this point, an adult, and you're not yet married, were you looking forward to marriage? I don't know if, at that point, if you were intensely looking forward in the mission field, but as you're back in the States at times, were you looking for marriage to be something sort of as soon as possible? And if you did sort of predict that God was going to open those doors and provide for you a husband, did you have any fear of sexuality being something wonderful? Was it just like, I can't wait, this is going to be great? Or was it going to be like, I don't know if I'm going to be comfortable in my own skin and if I'm going to please him, he's going to please me, whatever. How did your perspective on sexuality relate to your anticipation of a potential marriage?
Yeah. I remember I was terrified that I had the gift of singleness. I was like, please God, don't make me have the gift of singleness. I knew I didn't want to be single forever. And my dad often tells this story where he said, after having 3 rough and rowdy boys, we were so excited to have a sweet, quiet girl. Then we had Jenny. and
Nice.
and I'm really grateful that, I actually lived with parents that allowed my fieriness and my feistiness. That was not so welcome in the PCA or in the missionary circles that I was in. And so there did become this fear of, am I going to have to like squelch who I am in order to find a mate or find a partner? but I was still always looking for that. There was this joke that YWAM stands for Young Women After Men, and we were all looking for who would be our spiritual leader. And but I was very sure I didn't want someone that would be a distraction from God. And I was so into I Kiss Dating Goodbye and not even knowing myself enough. And so shortly after I moved to Seattle, I actually started hanging out with a man from Mars Hill Church, and we went on a date. And I remember telling my parents, and my mom said, "I thought you weren't going to date until it was the person you were going to marry." And I was like, "You're right." And in my mind, I was like, "Okay, I guess this is it." And unfortunately, that led into a 3-year really abusive and harmful relationship. And all of that again felt like my fault, because I think what is so damaging about purity culture, among many things, is that there's no teaching about consent. So even though there was no instances of consent in our relationship, I was sinning because I was doing things I wasn't supposed to do as a woman who grew up in purity culture. And so by that point, I still had never told anyone what happened in New York, much less what was happening with my boyfriend, because it was my fault. I was doing it wrong. I was responsible for these men's actions and sexuality. So I just wasn't being good enough in my purity culture role. And thank God I was able to get out of that 3 years later, which I think really actually coincided with my deconstruction. I had to be able to say, you don't have to marry this man because of what's happened in your relationship. And for a long time, I thought I did. I was soiled goods because of what had happened. Again, regardless of not having given consent, that didn't matter. It was that it happened in the first place.
It seems like in those cases too, once you've done something, it kind of seems like it's redeemed if you get married. Is that fair to say?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, all is washed away or all is forgiven, because it which I think reveals it's not actually about the sin, it's about the male possession. It's like, well, he already owns my body, so if we just get married, it just makes it sanctified, rather than my body is autonomous. I get to do what I want and share it with who I want. That's never a question in that world. It's always who is the male that's going to have authority and power over you.
Well, on that note, did you feel like when you got married, it would basically be you passing from your father's authority to your husband's authority?
At that point, I did. And well, I guess when I was together with him, by the time I ended with him, I did not feel that way. And when I met my current husband, he was also a huge part of my journey. It was our second date. He was like, "I need you to know, I'm very, very liberal. And it seems like you have some things you might need to work out if this is going to work out." And I totally kind of was like, challenge accepted. I didn't totally agree with a lot of what he said, but I also really liked him. And so it caused me to continue learning. And so by the time we knew we wanted to get married, we made the very conscious decision. Sorry, my dog wants to go get some water.
Oh, it's nice to see you. That's cool.
Yeah, sweetie.
What's his name again?
Amari.
Amari.
Yes. Thanks. So by the time my husband and I decided we wanted to get married, we made the very conscious decision that we were going to tell my parents we were going to get married. And he asked, I will ask your dad's permission if that's something you want. And at that point, it felt very important for me to not do that. And unfortunately and fortunately, that disrupted a lot in my family system for a very long time. And I'm grateful we've been on a journey of repair with my parents since then, but it really did implode a lot of the family system and how it was operating. And I think it revealed how much was orbiting around who and it's tricky because my dad, I think, would say, I never thought I owned you. And yet, in the world that I grew up in, that's what I was learning from all of my religious leaders. All of the things that I was learning was I needed to have a spiritual covering. I needed to have the head of the household, which wasn't going to be me. So I absolutely, for a long time, thought that I would be that transition. And by the time I did get married, I felt like I'm making this decision because this is a decision I wanted. And I think by that point, you know, my husband and I were living together before we were married, and yet I still wasn't telling anybody because I still felt shame, even though I was like, knew why we were doing it. I felt okay. I still felt so much like everyone else had a say on what I did. And I remember, we were still part of the PCA church at that point, and we told someone something about our apartment, and this guy from church goes, "Your apartment? When did you get married?" And it was just the clearest shame, just thrown at us. And thankfully by that point I was like, oh, we haven't yet. And I didn't need to take that in. But even in that process was when we were already knew we were leaving the church, so it didn't sting as bad. But when, that's your only community, it's really hard. And a lot of our conversations were around, do we want to lose our community? And our conversations then came around to, if we lose our community because we don't go to a building on Sunday, is that actual community? And is that the type of community we want if it's so conditional? And we were right. We lost everyone that we thought was part of our community once we stopped going there.
So were you not just living together, but were you actively at that point sort of escaping Christianity, or like when did that part of it come in? Because I would have honestly responded very similarly to the person you mentioned at church. Not that I would have necessarily said it, but I would have thought that, like, that sounds like your commitment to purity and to God's ways is not very firm right now. So either you're moving away from Christianity, or you're just trying to live on the slippery slope and either sin or get real close to it. Were you deconstructing heavily at that point of your faith as well?
Yeah, that was the point. We were like neck deep in Elaine Pagels and Bart Ehrman.
Okay.
I had already been a dance teacher for a really long time, but I was actually doing a yoga teacher training as well. And so that was really fascinating to me to learn more about Hinduism and the triune God of Hinduism, and how many similarities there were in this religion I hadn't really known much about. And I felt kind of sneaky because I was doing my yoga teacher training while I was supposed to be working at the church. And so there was all of these things that were kind of incognito. And it was such a complex thing because the pastor of that church was very, very helpful and there when I was a victim with my ex. And the healthier I got with my husband, Sean, the weirder and more strained our relationship got, if that makes sense. And so it was kind of this thing, this both and, where I was so grateful to have that community when I needed it to leave something that was even more toxic. And then when I found an even healthier relationship, I realized how toxic that also was. And so it felt like I was sort of, I don't want to say using my relationships, but my relationships were helping me move towards a healthier relationship with myself and with other people.
Gotcha. So in the context of living together, you weren't thinking I'm in danger of hellfire for this or God's going to get me. What was the steps though that took you? And I want to return to purity culture in just a minute, but like what were the steps that took you fully from the exploring and learning phase and the Bart Ehrman kind of level of I'm just learning more about my religion and its origin and its evolution, but going to the point of at that point, because it's like a lot of us would say when we're in it that deep where we just really believe it thoroughly, we would say, I can learn more and I may have some things I need to shift about this verse might have meant something different than I thought, but there's still some ground level, like everything comes back to this simple question of did Jesus come and die for our sins or didn't he? Was he crucified? Did he rise again? Is he at the right hand of the Father? Is he our savior? And that sense of like it doesn't really matter what I learn. I have seen God. I've it's part of it is intellectual, but it's the experience. I've tasted and seen that the Lord is good. I have seen him open doors. I've felt his peace. I have seen his felt his presence in my heart. I've seen the storms come and he calms them, just like he did for the disciples. And I know at the end of the day that despite my faith shifting a little bit, I'm rock solid with Jesus. Eventually something attacks that, obviously. What got you from the point of just
Mhm.
exploring the ideas, but yet God is God and Jesus is my Lord and Savior to I don't even think that's real. Maybe that's just pure mythology or it's just some kind of legend. But what got you over that to the point of being able to say, I'm sorry, but I'm out. I'm out. This
Mhm.
worldview is not an accurate representation of reality.
I honestly, I don't think I can overstress how vital Bart Ehrman has been in my journey. I've read almost all of his books and listened to all of his lectures, and I think primarily his work around how Jesus became God, um, and misquoting Jesus. And I think learning about that while seeing Trump get elected in 2016 and realizing how humans don't change all that much, and learning about the other book that has been pivotal is Constantine's Sword, and learning about the marriage between Christianity and power and military, and learning, I think, just seeing the bigger structures and the bigger systems and how primarily white men have often used narratives to disembody people. Uh, there's a scholar, Mina Salami, and she says tyrants have always understood the more robotic people are, the more easily manipulated they are. And so it was both this kind of learning more of the head knowledge, learning more of the history, and learning to trust my body, learning that my grief of breaking my foot at 14 years old and having my plans derailed is valid. And it's okay to feel that grief. And it's okay to feel the grief from all of these other things. Ultimately led me to I can't ethically get behind a structure and a system that, from what I can see, has manipulated this story to get people to be compliant, to prop a lot of money into the church, to justify Christian nationalism. And so for me, it became, I really like the second definition of integrity. So, like, the first one is like doing the right thing, and the second one is being wholehearted. And it just came down to I cannot be wholehearted and still invest in this emotionally, psychologically, relationally. There are so many parts of myself that I have to cut off in if I want to do this. And to be honest, there have been multiple times my husband and I have been like, should we just go back to church, like, and make community there? It feels like it can be so much easier in some ways. It's baked in. And we always come back to, like, it's not worth what we would have to sacrifice of ourselves in order to fit in to that worldview and that frame.
Yeah. And just to make a little pun off of the baked in concept, it's easy to miss the potlucks for sure. I miss it.
Absolutely.
Um, Sorry, it's a bad dad joke. Well, as you can you tell us a little bit more about your marriage? How did that start? And what did you feel like as you at that point had done so much deconstruction and deconversion at that point that you were able to enter into marriage in what you might call a healthy way? And like, what were some of the big lessons that you learned as you were kind of unraveling what you learned about purity culture? How did that, how did you basically create a foundation for a really strong marriage, not just in terms of your commitment level and your love for each other, but in your ability to take some of the bad ideas and discard them as much as possible and just start fresh and learn what, take as much toxicity out of the equation as you could and bring as much healthiness to it to get started?
It's so funny because my marriage story is one of those things now kind of not being in Christianity that I don't know how to make sense of. um, because we actually met by a total fluke. I got a Facebook friend request from this guy named Sean McGrath, and I had never met him. We didn't have any friends in common. So usually I would have just deleted his request. But his picture was him as this little boy overlooking this lake all whimsically. And I was like, who is this guy? And so I click it and I see he's living in Seattle, where I was. And then I see he is a cinematographer and editor, and he had done a documentary for Engineers Without Borders in the same village that I worked in Uganda. So I was like, okay, someone must have told him to connect with me. So I messaged him and asked, what were you doing in Gulu? And we spent the whole day talking. And then at the end of the day, he was like, I'd love to hear more. Do you think I could take you out? And I was like, well, how did you find me? And he was like, well, you found me. And at that point, I was like, no, you definitely sent me a Facebook friend request. And he said, I did, but I've been working from home sick on Skype. And I got a Skype request from a Jenny Wagner. So I looked you up on YouTube or on Facebook. And I was like, I haven't been on Skype in years. Who uses Skype still? And he sends me this screen grab, and it was a friend request from a Jenny Wagner, but she had spelled the last name different. And so it was like this total random connection. And we
Wow.
met, and it was like 2 weeks later, we're like, we're going to get married, aren't we? And it was just weird how not weird it was. And
Like it
we still
was
had
otherwise a God thing, right?
exactly. That's why I'm like, I don't know how to make sense of it other than just to be very grateful. And so Amari actually means I love you in Acholi, and that's how she got her name. But we also had to do a ton of therapy, both individually. We did couples therapy, we did sex therapy, we did all kinds of work. Again, he grew up in purity culture as well and had his own trauma in that world. And so a lot of our first 5 years was great and really hard work. And we're still, I feel like, doing really good and really hard work. I think, yeah, I feel like it has continually been a learning curve for us to process through our own stories and the collective story that we've both been indoctrinated in our whole lives.
Mm. And I know we kind of mentioned this in the bio, but you work with people, helping other people work through purity culture, and you write about it and think about it. But when you look at your story and the stories of the people that you talk to, and just the things that you are connecting with on various different platforms, what are some of the biggest hurdles that you find for people to, or just the biggest topics in general, for people to really dig into to get to a point where they can reclaim their autonomy, embrace eroticism, and just be really happy to be, have their body, and certainly if they're in a relationship to enjoy intimacy? Like, what are some of the biggest hurdles that people have to get over to get to that healthy point?
So I would say for me and my work, I've worked primarily with people who have been socialized as white women within purity culture. And so honestly, this may sound, I don't know how this will sound, but one of the biggest hurdles is for myself and my clients over the years is remembering that we have bodies, because there is such a disembodiment. I remember in grad school, we were doing a group therapy type class, and someone asked me, "Where do you feel that in your body?" And I just looked at them like, "What are you talking about?" And there is such a robotic, disassociated narrative, I think, and reality that happens for primarily white women socialized in purity culture. And I think because purity culture is such a system of binary, whether that's gender, whether that's race, whether that's purity, impurity, it affects everybody, but it affects differently based on race and gender and sexual orientation. And so I think there's a lot of different varieties and impacts that it can have. I also think, we live in a country that is built around the white heteronormative Christian family. So for a lot of white women who maybe are starting to get in touch with their body, their sexuality, they might have been married for 30 years and their financial dependence is on their partner to varying degrees of health and encouragement. And so I think there are also very real financial and social aspects to what it looks like to disenfranchise yourself with the white heteronormative Christian family that you get tax benefits for, you get health care for, you get all of these things in which we live in a society where relationships are privileged. And so if someone is wanting to engage their own autonomous journey or polyamory or other ways of being, there are a lot of really real consequences to that. And so I think that's a really big hindrance for people. And I've seen so many people express like, I have terror starting to engage this because I don't know what the cost will be. I don't know how my husband's going to take it. I don't know what's going to happen. And yeah, I think those are some of the big things that I've seen.
Yeah. It's interesting too, to me, the ways that it seems like the experience in some ways is so very different for men versus women. And of course, different denominations are going to preach it differently. But I've noticed for myself, one of the biggest differences is I hear a lot of women saying that they feel extremely objectified and that they're trying to, pull back from that and take their power back. But it's interesting for a lot of guys, it's the exact opposite in that they have been taught so thoroughly to never objectify a woman in my church environment. I mean, of course, there's always going to be the person that's like there for Christmas and Easter that's not really in it. They're going to do what they want to do. But the people that are like actually tracking when the pastor preaches, you take it seriously. And so he's taught you from the earliest days and the men's Bible studies, you don't objectify a woman for a millisecond or you're disobeying God. And so for a lot of guys, it's the exact opposite of what a woman is saying, where for a man, healing from purity culture is giving himself the freedom to say, I just like breasts. I just want to have sex. And it's not like you're trying to turn a woman into a piece of meat, but at the same time, you're also trying to say, this has been the aspect where I've never been able to be free with myself. Like I want to enjoy a woman's beauty. And it like when you look at women's journeys versus men's journeys, like what differences are you seeing and how do you think they can help each other maybe to say, I know your journey was the complete opposite of mine in some ways, but we can kind of learn to see each other's perspectives in this and help each other and and just understand each other to say, I understand why you're doing that. I understand why, maybe for a man who gets married, every time his wife gets undressed to go get in the shower, he just is dying to look at her because maybe when he was a young man who was in purity culture, he was so repressed from seeing her. And maybe for her that feels like, oh, why are you constantly ogling me? Why do you want to look at me constantly when I'm taking my bra off? Like that may be objectifying to her. And she wants to feel like she's, yes, a body, but she's more than that. And for him, he's trying to just be like, I just finally want to enjoy sex. I want to enjoy your body. It's okay. I love seeing a woman's breasts bouncing around, and that's a good thing. It's a normal thing. I shouldn't be ashamed of myself for that. I've been ashamed for 30, 40 years. I shouldn't be ashamed. I'm changing my course. How do men and women start to stop talking past each other perhaps, and start to see each other's journeys and hurt, see each other's wounds, and say, I can help you with this, but we need to understand where each other, how the journeys were different.
Hmm. Hmm. I if it is a partnership, I cannot recommend sex therapy more with a trusted sex therapist who understands purity culture. Because I've also had a lot of clients who've been harmed by therapists who didn't understand how oppressive and dogmatic this world is. And so they've said to partners, very dismissive things that make them feel even more shame for not wanting to have sex or for feeling all of these things. And so I think um, there is a post purity healing website that I can also send you to link here. That's all purity culture informed therapists who work on different aspects of this, because I do think it is something that just requires so much support and help, because these messages are so ingrained and so internalized and really ancient. Like a lot of these are like epigenetically ingrained messages in different bodies based on how our society looks at them. And so I think being able to immerse yourself in sex positive content and recognizing that it's okay, and also recognizing, something that I say for a lot of my clients, because not a lot, but well, maybe a lot of people might identify as asexual. And especially if they have been socialized as women, they've never been given permission to not want to or to not have sex. And so I like to say, sexual liberation doesn't look like having a lot of sex. It might. Sexual liberation might look like never having sex again. And that can create a lot of need to renegotiate what relationships might look like. And that might even engage consciously uncoupling if there have been people that got married at 18, 19 years old and never had the opportunity to question who they are sexually, and then maybe they're in a relationship that's not working for them.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just such a delicate journey. And I would say, give yourself time, because, it can feel like, oh my God, it's been 5 years. And it's like, yes, but 5 years compared to how many years in this worldview, especially in your most developmental years where you were just soaking all of this up as a sponge, it can be really hard to navigate and to explore that.
Yeah. Mm. I I can imagine that there is just so much pain on some of these discussions. Just whether you're talking about just a basic sexless marriage, or you're talking about people trying to not realize that they might have a same-sex attraction. They've it's all these things have implications for their marriages, and there's so many painful discussions and revelations and self-revelations, counseling together, counseling privately. It's amazing when you step back from it all, you just think this worldview has hurt us so badly, and it's probably made some people marry for very wrong reasons. Like this couple, you probably should have never gotten married. Like it wasn't for the right reasons. And I know for me, and a lot of other people that I knew back in the day, it was all about, are you a good ministry partner? And the idea of sexual compatibility was just like, God will fix that. It's like, are we good? If you're going to be a pastor, or, is the man going to be a pastor? Or will you be a good pastor's wife, missionary's wife, whatever? Are you all good fit for this? And it's realizing Christianity deceives you in so many ways, but it also just takes away your ability to make really wise decisions about some of the biggest parts of your life. And I know I'm making a very blanket statement in some of that, and I know that there's a lot of nuance in that, but some people probably just simply would have, if they had known more and had more wisdom in their discussions, at an earlier age, they probably would have not married the person that they ended up with, and avoided probably a lot of pain. You never know. But when you look at this, for your perspective and how far you've come, like, how do you feel like your healing journey is at this point? Do you feel like you've been able to unravel a lot of the harder parts of it for you, or do you feel like it's still you're in the throes of it, or like where are you with the journey?
Yeah. I think both. I think I anticipate this will be a lifelong journey for me. And one of the many professionals that I worked with at one point said, it's not that this work gets easier, it's that you grow your capacity to bear this work. And I have felt that to be true.
Mm.
And a few years ago, because my husband is a cinematographer and editor, we actually filmed together an embodied sexuality course, where I have lectures on the history of purity culture, on consent, on sexual trauma. And we made this course together several years ago, and we still go through it together now. We still read like the resources, and we talk about them. And it's still hard. I don't know that it'll ever be easy. And we both get reactive, and we're both like, okay. And then we high five and say, we did it at the end. And so I think it's going to be a while, if not forever, that we're continuing to engage this. And I know that's not the same for everyone. I know some people that are like, yeah, I just threw away Christianity and purity culture and now life's great. I'm just not one of those people for whatever reason that is. I need this process to be a lot slower and a lot, for me, more gentle. And so I think that's just going to continue to take a lot of time. And I think it also, for me, part of that is that I really want to be conscious of the privileges I've had in white heteronormativity. And so, how do I continue to be responsible for the privileges and the power that I'm given in these systems so that my liberation and freedom isn't coming at the expense of folks who are disproportionately impacted because of racism and heteronormativity in these systems? And so, for me, part of engaging our sexuality and healing from purity culture is engaging imperialism and the justification for imperialism, and that often the binary was and is that white women are pure and women of color are hypersexualized. And how does that set up for lack of support, for harm, for all of these things that happen that are not separate from sexuality, but that impact the laws in our country today, and how do we engage those in all of the ways? I think is a slower, more tedious journey.
Yeah, it's interesting though. One thing I would reflect on is that it's an amazing thing to think that when you have someone who's thought through it to your level, that, and not necessarily just you, just anybody who's trying to grapple with these things, that as we if we do have our own children, that it's amazing to think that the journey can be hopefully so much better for the next generation. And I know, I love that it's been a big topic for, I think, a lot of people in the last generation or so to say stuff to kids like, you don't have to accept a hug if you don't want to, it's your body. And the autonomy discussions are appropriately growing and getting more I think embedded in our society in some ways. But I love too that for my journey, like I've got four small children, I've been able to weave in the what I would call the parallel journey of not just bodily autonomy but thought autonomy, and to say, not just do you not only do you have the freedom to reject a hug or whatever, you get to decide, and we'll say it's your body, you get to decide, but also for your brain, like you get to decide what thoughts you want. And I love having those discussions with my kids to be able to say, you can be exposed to what this person thinks and that person believes. And it's good. It's a really good thing to go to church. It's a really good thing to read the Bible. It's a good thing to hear this story and that story in Greek mythology. But at the end of the day, you get to decide. You have the power over yourself. And that message, I love that my kids are hearing it. And I know a lot of other deconstructing families would do something, I'm sure, very similar, just saying the power is on you. It's your body, your mind, your life. And we're not going to threaten you. You don't have to think like us. We're going to let you decide what's best for you. And what a beautiful gift to give to the next generation. I feel like if there was some way I could augment and just put that on blast, I'd love to do that, because I hope our culture gets that. Because so much of Christianity is that sense of like, no, I mean, you can explore, but at the end of the day, you have to come back to this particular point, this belief system, or else, and not just for now, but for eternity. it's a really bad outcome if you don't have the bare bones basics of the gospel in line. And just to take away the threats, it's like you can't even imagine what childhood would be like without that overarching umbrella of this threat. And yet my kids don't have that umbrella. And I don't know. What do you think about that?
I love it. Yeah, I think what's coming to mind, I feel like I'm quoting all my therapists today, is the phrase, nothing is a problem until it's the only solution. And that's something that I've clung to for several years now, where anything that we become dogmatic about, I think, can become such a hindrance. And so it just feels like such a gift, and for me, I have to believe in intergenerational healing in order to stay in this work because it is so hard. And I have to believe that future generations, whether they're biological or not, are going to be impacted by the work that we're doing here and now, and that it will make a difference. And yeah, I love that. And it makes me like jealous and happy at the same time.
Exactly. Well, I know I've kept you for a while. I just had a final few quick questions, so we'll wrap up. The first question: how have people treated you, not about the purity culture discussion, but just about escaping Christianity? How have your loved ones, family, and friends responded? Have you had some respect? Have you had shunning? Like, what's that journey been like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's been an arc to it. Originally, it was pretty rough. And with some family members, with other family members, I was actually the one apologizing for, like, I'm sorry I made you a project for so many years, and they were like, welcome back. And, we had these really beautiful moments. And I think it's really interesting to feel on the other side of that, where I now feel a bit like a project. Like, I feel loved, and I feel that there are family members that are very worried about me, that were not worried about me 10 years ago. And so that's been really interesting and hard, to see, like, I actually don't, that's not what love would be for me. What would be love would be to, like, be engaging me right here, right now.
Do they think you're going to hell? Do you think?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there is, and I think it helps for me to know it is out of concern that they are saying what they're saying, or sending what they're sending, or doing what they're doing. But it's just like, yeah, and that's not gonna change, how I see the world. So that's been my family. And what's been hard is that really so I ended up working for the Allender Center, working for churches, like, was so involved in the Christian world in many different facets for a long time. And it's been about 3 years since I left all of that. And there are maybe a couple friends who are still my friends from that world. And the people that I really thought were my community have kind of just vanished. And it has felt like, if you're not for us, you're against us. And if you're not for us means if you're not helping us turn a profit, then you just don't exist. And so that's been really hard. I think I have my own dismissive attachment style in general. And so it's really hard for me not to just be like, okay. And so to try to, like, stay invested and to stay vulnerable in relationships, when I've lost all of the significant relationships I've had primarily in the last lifetime, other than a couple wonderful ones. So yeah, I think that's also, I think, a big hindrance for people leaving is, especially if you're in a smaller town or you're in a place where that is the community, is you have to buy in. It's a really difficult thing, I think, to break away and to leave the fold, as Marlene Weinell would say.
Yeah, it takes so much bravery. Well, a final question I had, and then if there's anything else that that I didn't get to that you wanted to cover and add on at the end here. But the last question that I like to ask quite a bit, if you if we're talking to someone regarding deconstruction, deconversion, and they're at the hardest parts of it, where they're like, I can't go back, but I'm not sure where I'm going to land, but I know that these questions are going to ruffle a lot of feathers. I know I need counseling. I'm going to get a counselor or whatever therapist, but just for that person that's anticipating that this is going to get really crazy or difficult soon, and maybe not crazy in terms of just the community's response, but just internally, they're just like, there's so much angst. I honest to God don't know if God's there. I think he's there, but I don't know. And I can see myself landing a couple different places. And I could also see myself just not knowing for a while. And that's angst too, to just land in this confusion and muck of who knows? Is there a God? Isn't there? Should I pray? Or am I praying to the wall? I don't know. And it's all very, in some ways, a dark place to be, a very sad place to be. And especially if people are knowing that if they talk about that openly, they will get a lot of pushback and a lot of even hatred. For the people that are going through that, what do you say based on your journey? What are some of the things you'd advise to somebody besides getting a therapist?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I so appreciate what you're doing here is that for myself and for so many people I know, podcasts or YouTube channels, especially if you're not proximately connected to folks on that journey, knowing you're not alone is so important. And I also recognize there's a huge barrier to therapy and to affordable services. And so um, I don't underestimate online communities and the ways in which you can get support. I would also just normalize, yeah, it really it's hard and it's really scary. And that is part of the journey and the process. And I had someone actually recently send me they had just heard, I think it might have been on some evangelical podcast or something where they were saying, we are a community that's moving in a direction, but we don't know the destination. And to me, that partly is scary, but it also isn't. The more I have learned about evolution and the more that I've learned that everything is movement, everything is process, and dogma wants to say this is where you land, this is where it ends, but I think that actually is a way that we stunt ourselves. And so I think it's less about, eventually I think it can become less about needing an answer and more about trusting our capacity to evolve and to shift and to change and to grow and to adapt, and know that in 30 years you might not be where you are today. Lovely. Like, how wonderful is that, that we get to continue expanding our human experience, our empathy, our conscious awareness. And when you've lived in a world that has given you right and wrong, good and bad, yes and no, that can be really, really disruptive. And so those would be a few of the things that I would say.
Mm, I love it. I love it. The thing I tack on sometimes with my journey, one of the biggest things that helped me was, and this is not a quick answer. This isn't something you can do in a day or a week or even a month, or even a year, but to really get exposed to where the mythology came from. And you kind of alluded to that with Elaine Pagels and Bart Ehrman. But the more that you can, like, I see some people get threatened by, like, I hear the atheists claim this, but then the Christians say this and they sound so smart. And the atheists come back with this, and the Christian sounds so, and you can be like a ping pong ball, not knowing who to believe and who's telling you the truth and the whole truth. And the more that I've been deconverted about 4.5 years now, the longer I go, the people that are the healthiest and the most grounded to me are the people that have done so much work to understand, where did this mythology behind Yahweh and the Gospels, where did it come from? And I love it, because, and it helps you just to, like, honestly, it's part of the healing, because you're like, that's really silly. Like, I can't believe I believed that, knowing now where it came from. It's like, come on, like, really? And the further I go from it, the more I do think I should have gotten out earlier, because it seems more obvious than ever. But being able to truly get educated, like you mentioned, with the books you read and so forth, it helps so much. And I think, because one of the things that happened, at least to me, was, I guess it's like Stockholm syndrome. And I know I may be misusing that concept, but just the idea, like, why was I so in love with my captor? Who was he? Why did I think this was such a good thing? Why was he such a psychopath, but I called him a good father, and I'd sing songs that brought me to tears over it. And yet he was commanding genocide and land theft and child brides. Like, why was I in love with him? And I think the more that you understand like, how did this whole journey of this whole religion and how did your interpretation of it shape your perspective? And it helps me at least a little bit to sort of undo the threads a little bit. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's not the emotional work. It's very intellectual work, but it has an emotional side effect, at least it did to me, to kind of bring it to almost a comedic level. Like, this is really funny. Like, I say these things a lot, but like Helios, the sun god, he would wear a purple robe and he had the crown of the sun rays around his head. Jesus has a purple robe and a crown of thorns. Hermes, the Flash, he walks across the water with the golden slippers. Then Jesus walks across the water. Zeus was known for crying tears of blood and water. Then Jesus does it. Dionysius, of course, does the turning water into wine, and then he rides into town on a donkey. Jesus, it's like, okay, this is real. Like, if I had been in that Greco-Roman society and understood Greco-Roman pantheon and the Greco-Roman mystery cults, I would have seen red flags on this everywhere as a literal history. I would have said, I see what you did there. I see what you did there. Okay. You're copying this and that. And it just would have been a non-issue. But once you get educated, you're like, but it also, I think, helps you to realize, and this is a bit of a side note, and I apologize, I'm diverting a little bit, but it helps you to forgive the past generations a little bit, because you're like, you didn't know this stuff, did you? I want to think better of you, but you didn't know like almost any of this stuff we're talking about. And it's like, no, it wasn't there. Like, you couldn't have even gone there was no internet, but you couldn't have gone to a library and researched it easily. We didn't know. We thought this was real. And it kind of helps me to forgive them a little bit. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I felt that similarly too. Yeah, it's become so illuminating.
Yeah. And we take advantage of the internet, but it's like that was a big game changer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say the one thing I might add is like I've needed all of that too, and I've also needed to just feel good in my body, whether that's like just rolling on the ground, whether that's biking, whatever that is. I feel like I like to say putting my frontal cortex on a shelf and just giving myself permission to be a body. Because for me also, the big thing was learning that, a lot of our duality idea of soul and body comes from Plato as well. And so realizing that my body is also so important and it's not split off as this other thing has been really necessary for me in coming back to myself, or maybe coming to myself for the first time.
I love it. Yeah, and I think evolution too, just, you mentioned that before, but just realizing we're connected to the planet, we're connected to this whole thing. It felt before like, we're kind of not part of this earth. We're part of heaven. We're the kingdom. We're enemies of this system. And it's like, no, you're not enemies of this system. You're in the system. It's in you. You're part of it. And if you don't understand and appreciate it, you're not going to appreciate your one single life and just delight in yourself. And anyway, I digress.
Yeah.
Well, I know we asked a lot of questions, but was there anything we didn't get to that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
I can't think of anything. I feel like we covered a lot of territory. It's been really fun to get to connect with you.
Yeah, likewise. Can I ask this? I should have asked this before, but are you taking new like clients, and should people reach out to you if they feel like they're interested?
Yeah, absolutely. I am.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'll just take us to a wrap up point then by saying that, to please do check out the links beneath this video for Jenny's website and all the other things that I've got linked there. And just, Jenny, it's been awesome to get to know you, hear your story. You're doing great work. I love it. And I would love to have you back. I'm working on at some point getting a roundtable for the purity culture topic. I'd love to have you back to be part of that roundtable. But for today, thank you for being so vulnerable with so many of these hard topics. And I really appreciate who you are, what you're doing. And thanks for sharing your story today.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.